Welcome back. Thank you very much. I hope you managed to refresh. And most importantly, I hope you managed to exchange your business cards or utilize your digital LinkedIn. You know, there's a saying, your network is your net worth. And we are here to collaborate and rub our minds to come up with better solutions or more solutions and turn these ideas into reality. I also want to say that I hope the morning session resonated with you. It certainly inspired me, and you can also look forward for the afternoon session, because we actually have academics, practical scientists, CEOs who are actively providing a solution towards the economic, I was going to say economic, but I mean environmental challenges that we face today. I would like to welcome our next speaker. And our next speaker, he is going to join us online, so I'm going to move slightly on the side. He is Professor for Sustainable Energy at the Imperial College of London, and he's also the head of the Intergovernmental Organization for Panel on Climate Change. Please welcome Jim Skee. Jim Skee, are you with us?
Oh, I'm with you, and I can hear you well. So thank you very much, Rita, for the introduction. And also thanks for the invite to talk at this very important conference. And it's my real regret not to be there in person. You were promised a data-driven talk. So I am actually going to use slides based on recent IPCC reports to illustrate the points I'm going to make. Now, the title of the talk is Keeping 1.5 Degrees Within Reach. And I have to say it's very tempting to add a question mark at the end of that. It is still possible, in principle, that warming could be limited to 1.5 degrees by the end of this century, though probably with a limited degree of temporary overshoot. But this can only take place with the immediate action that we've already heard about in the previous panel. Now, if you could move on to the first slide, please. So you can see why I'm making this statement. This slide illustrates scenarios assessed by IPCC in the last cycle, and it shows how greenhouse gas emissions needed to drop in order to limit warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. A 43% reduction by 2030 for 1.5 degree scenarios, which is the blue band at the bottom, and 26% by 2030 for 2 degrees warming, the green band. But you will notice that these were all starting from a 2019 baseline. And since 2019, emissions have unfortunately moved along the top pink band, which represents the trends from policies implemented since 2020. And given the cumulative nature of carbon dioxide emissions, it is very evident that delay has reduced the likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees C. In the immediate action scenario, the one in the blue band, there was a likelihood of between a third and a half of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees throughout the 21st century. In other words, never exceeding 1.5. If emissions were to fall more slowly, in line with the pledges that the governments have made, the nationally determined contributions represented by the purple band, which has a big corner in it, the emissions need to fall all the more quickly after 2030, and the likelihood of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees has fallen to between a tenth and a third. So delay unambiguously diminishes the chances of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. And 4 of the 11 years between 2019 and 2030 have already been largely unused in terms of climate action. Okay, so can we move on to the second slide, please, which looks a little bit further into the future. Next slide, please. So the left-hand panel explores the 1.5 degrees blue emission pathway from the previous slide. Carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere and accounts for most of greenhouse gas emissions. So carbon dioxide, the purple band in the middle, reach net zero emissions around 2050 globally. And recall also that net zero is the balance between emissions in hard to abate sectors and removals of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. You cannot limit global warming without taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And note further that carbon dioxide emissions go net negative after mid-century. There's no practical way of removing greenhouse gases other than carbon from the atmosphere, so they reach net zero much later, towards the 21st century, if at all. I'll just say I won't talk about the right-hand panel. It corresponds to the 2-degree scenarios, and basically the same things happen, but at a later point in the future. Now, another way of looking at this is through the idea of a carbon budget. And given that carbon dioxide accumulates in the atmosphere, there's a limited amount of carbon dioxide that we can emit for any given warming level. So the third slide, if we can move on, please, shows that at the start of 2020, the remaining carbon budgets, this is roughly in the middle of the slide, the remaining carbon budget to limit warming to 1.5 degrees was 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. For 2 degrees, with a 2/3 likelihood, it was 1,350 gigatons. Now, simple arithmetic. Since annual carbon dioxide emissions were around 45 gigatons in 2019, though still rising, more than 1/3 of that carbon budget will have been used up by the end of this year. And if emissions continue as they are, the 1.5 degree budget will have almost been used up by 2030. Now, the final data-driven point that I want to make is that the timing of net zero is different in different sectors. So if we could move on to the 4th slide, please. And this refers to 1.5 degree scenarios that correspond to the blue band in the very first slide that I showed. Now, it looks at what the timing of net zero for land use, energy supply, the energy demand sectors, and non-carbon dioxide emissions. And the striking point is that the first sector to reach net zero is actually land use change, which comes around 2030, though I have to say with large uncertainty ranges. And this is largely linked to avoided deforestation and reforestation. Next comes energy supply, which is dominated by electricity generation in the early 2040s, still before global net zero. And the phasing out of fossil fuels and their replacement by renewables, and dare I say in Austria, nuclear in some countries, as came up in the last panel, underpins the transition to net zero. Projected emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure exceeds the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. So some existing fossil fuel assets must remain unused if warming is to be limited to 1.5 degrees. The other striking statistic is that 80% of current oil reserves, 50% of current gas reserves, and 20% of current oil reserve would need to remain unburned, even to limit warming to 2 degrees. From this slide, you can also note that in the energy demand sectors, which are transport, buildings, and industry, reductions in emissions need to be about 70% by 2050 in the middle of the range. And in fact, in these sectors, they don't generally reach net zero in the 21st century at all, due to the absence of carbon removal techniques, though there is some possibility for doing that in the industrial sector. So to put it in a nutshell, it's still possible in principle that warming could be limited to 1.5 degrees, but with every passing year of inaction, the likelihood falls. If we carry on as we are, the carbon budget for 1.5 degree warming could be exhausted by 2030 or shortly thereafter. And what we can achieve in the energy sector is absolutely critical. And I'm sure it will come up at the conference, but IPCC identified so many possibilities for action in the near term. Renewable energy, avoided deforestation and reforestation, reducing methane emissions from fossil fuel infrastructure that could have a big impact in the short term. But without immediate and very ambitious climate action, it is almost certain that we will exceed 1.5 degrees warming, even if only temporarily. And just to say, that ambitious action in the energy sector is absolutely essential. Globally, we need energy supply to reach net zero emissions before 2050, not at 2050, with substantial reductions in energy demand. Now, I know we scientists can make these scenarios hard to interpret, but I hope the messages have become very clear. The time for action is now. Now, just a few words on the prospects for the IPCC seventh cycle, which is just starting. And it can be a very few number of words because we simply don't know what reports will be produced. Governments are going to make that decision at a meeting in January, which will take place in Istanbul. But they will be acting on the advice of the IPCC's scientific leadership, the Bureau, of which I'm part. And one of the key considerations is going to be the link to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and specifically the timing of the second global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So I'm afraid in terms of the seventh cycle, it's going to be watch this space. But thank you very much for your attention. Once again, I regret not being with you. It looks like it was both fun and enlightening. And so I certainly wish you the best for the rest of the conference.
Thank you, Jimski. Your words are very much respected. You've been dealing with almost 50 years to the topic of global warming, I understand. And it shows that you're optimist, but at the same time, you're presenting us a dire situation that our carbon budget is depleting. So may I ask you, are you an optimist more or more pessimist in this regard?
I mean, I'm genetically an optimist, but I have to say we are living in fairly challenging times at the moment. And I do think I kind of summed it up there. Unless we act absolutely immediately and ambitiously, the question mark behind the title of the talk, keeping 1.5 degrees within reach, is a very real one. So I have to be optimistic, but also realistic at the same time. We face big challenges, and we could be running out of rope on that 1.5 degrees limit.
Thank you very much for taking the time to join us. Jimski, everyone.